in this for 42 Sunday mornings so far in this book of Acts, and it's the study of the history and acts of the early Christian church. And we can learn a lot from this about original pure Christianity before religion got a hold of it. And as we've seen the last couple Sundays, actually, Paul's third missionary journey and his last missionary journey has ended, but his work is not done. He was detained in Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey because of religious mob violence, and he was falsely accused, if you recall, of inciting violence and defiling the temple. And they claimed that he brought a Gentile in, and they couldn't prove that, and they knew it. And these were all nebulous, unprovable charges that they brought, as we'll see here in our study again today, because it's repeated. But regardless, Paul is detained, and he's in Roman custody, and it's really for his own protection in Jerusalem, because they're trying to kill him. They're seeking his life, these sweet religious folks. And we've seen who the enemies of Christ's church is, and the ones who gladly receive the gospel message, and the ones who violently oppose it throughout this entire study, and through the Gospels. When you look at the life of Christ, it's very contrasted by. You can see who his opposition is. But we left off in chapter 23 at verse 14, I think. But let's back up. Let's go ahead. Let's look at that. Let's back up to verse 11. Not that it might not be on here. It's not on here. I'll just read it for you. It says, but the following night, now this is after he was detained again, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. So as you have testified for me, you must also be. So it was very encouraging for Paul to hear this from Jesus himself. You're not off track. Continue serving me as he has been. You're going to be serving me in the same way. That is, detained, imprisoned, and before magistrates and before rulers and governors and kings. Even he's going to be brought before them to testify, and he's the right man for the job. And then verse 12, it says, when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there was more than 40 who formed this conspiracy. This is where we left off. We talked about this oath. Sometimes folks would make these wrath oaths before God and men, and they would be willing to, in a rash moment, be willing to accept the consequences of that, and then they'd realize that they couldn't live up to it. So they would go to the rabbis and get absolved from it for whatever reason they could make, excuse they could make. So they could be easily absolved, and the vow became nothing more than an embarrassment and and an undermining of the person's credibility who made the rash vow. But so verse 14 is really where we left off. So these men that made this vow, it says more than 40 of them, made a vow to kill Paul. Verse 14, they came to the chief priests and elders, the religious leaders here, and they says, we have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you therefore, together with the council, that's the 70, that's the Sanhedrin, the high hypocrite religious folks, and together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought, that he is Paul, that you bring Paul down tomorrow, as though, in other words, insinuating that you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. It's a lie. We're ready to kill him before he comes near. You see what their plot is, and they want to involve the high priest, the priests, and the entire Sanhedrin council on this. And so and of course they agree to it, murder, and now they're complicit in it. They're actually going to be part of it because they're going to set up the circumstances by which Paul could be murdered. And so, that this corruption, where there is power corrupts, of course, anywhere, but you add religious power in there, and this is what these folks were, and you got a great potential for evil, and we've seen this throughout all history, and our founding fathers saw it, and they even while seeking to honor the Creator in everything they wrote and did, in all their public meetings, they sought to honor and acknowledge the Creator, and in their documents and public gatherings. But they were very careful, and they were determined to keep religious systems out of government, out of the power of government being incorporated into government. And this is an example as to why that was so wise on the part of our founding fathers. But we see that the chief of they agree to this, as we're going to see. So they're complicit, actively involving themselves in this. And these are men that claim to have been committed to the law of God. Really interesting how it's they can be so blinded by their own religion. They actually think that they're serving God by doing this. And this is the problem with religion is in the name of religion, many evils have been perpetrated throughout all of human history. And this is another one. So let's look at verse 16. So when Paul's sister's son heard of the ambush, so this is his, would that be his nephew? This is his nephew. He went and entered the barracks and told Paul. So they let him come in and visit Paul. And he tells them, hey, 40 men, at least 40 have vowed to kill you. And they got the Sanhedrin, and they got the council in on it too. And look at what Paul wisely does. Paul calls one of the centurions and said to him, take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell them. Now, he's not going to tell the centurion and let it get out. This is going to be kept between the commander and Paul's nephew here. So he took, verse 18, he took him, and this young man, Paul's nephew, and he brought him to the commander and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you. Now, Paul must have been quite confident that this Roman commander would deal with this appropriately, and he does. Let's look at how he deals with it. Verse 19. Then the commander took him by the hand and went aside and asked privately. See, he doesn't want this plot to get out to the soldiers, and then the fact that the commander knows about the plot would get out, you see? So the commander asked him privately, what is it you have to tell me? And one consistent thing we've seen in the New Testament is that all the recorded accounts we have of Roman soldiers, the Roman military, that'd be the soldiers, the commanders, the centurions, shows that they were all noble, conscientious, fair, uncorrupted by money and things like this, and they served with integrity and honor. However, you contrast that with the political appointees, the non-military, the political appointees of Rome, that'd be the Herods and Agrippas and the local proconsuls, and they were all thoroughly corrupt. And anyway, this commander, Luke actually gives us his name coming up here in verse 26. His name is Claudius Lysias, so we have that historically. Claudius Lysias, And he's already saved Paul from being beaten to death twice now. And so let's look at verse 20. And so his nephews is telling the commander here. He says, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you. And look, the Jews have agreed to ask on behalf of these. So the Sanhedrin agreed to it, and they're going to be part of it. So they're going to set up this little thing, and they're ready. And this signifies the seriousness of these men. They have vowed to neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. Now, Paul's in prison, so they might have a long wait. So that's why another reason why they had to set up this thing and get the Sanhedrin, the high priest and stuff involved to arrange for Paul's at least temporarily being less protected as they transport him to an inquiry before the council. And verse 22, so the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, look, son, tell no one that you've revealed these things to me. He needs this. He doesn't want anybody to know that he knows what's going on here. And, these Roman military were very sensitive about Rome continuously being manipulated by the Jews. It happened so often, and they were used by the Jews. The military was, and the proconsuls were, and they got tired of being tricked into being part of the Jews' evil plots. One of them crucifying our Lord Jesus. As Claudius Lysias here, he really appreciates this opportunity to outmaneuver the Jews in their evil plot here. So let's look at verse 23. And he called for 2 centurions, saying, prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea on the 3rd hour of the night. So that's, I guess, 3 a.m. And provide mounts, or maybe that's midnight, because I can't remember what exactly time that is, but 3rd hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. So he's going to get safe transport to Felix the governor. And he gives Paul really an escort worthy of royalty here. 470 men, if you do the math. 70 horsemen, 200 this and 200 that. It's as if God wanted to put an exclamation point on his faithfulness to Paul. Remember what the verse I quoted, verse 11, that he says, no harm's going to come to you. It was when he had told Paul, be of good cheer, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome. You're going to make it all the way to Rome. Paul might have thought, it's going to end for me here in Jerusalem, but no, he's got this royal escort here with a military escort. So verse 25. So the commander here wrote a letter in the following manner: Claudius Lysias, so we have his name, to the most excellent governor Felix. Greetings, most excellent governor Felix. Well, more on that later. Of course, Claudius here, this is not necessarily to butter up Felix, but he has to do this as a Roman military commander. He has to give this proconsul, this Felix, the governor, proper salutation here. So verse 27, He says, this man, he's talking about Paul, this man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them. Coming with troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Now, Claudius here conveniently leaves out the little matter about Paul being bound and almost scourged by himself until he learned that he was a Roman. And then he was like, oh, wait a minute. All right, verse 28. And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council, the Sanhedrin. Verse 29, I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. In other words, I can't even hold this man, but I am. He's holding them right now because he's got to keep the peace. Remember, I talked last week about the pickle. This commander's in here. He's charged with peace and rest in the city of Jerusalem while he's assigned there. And if he releases Paul, there'll be another, there'll be a tumult again, another uprising. And so he's kind of in a pickle. And so there's nothing against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told to me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell. So short and sweet, just the facts. Verse 31, then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. The next day, they left the horsemen to go on with him and returned to the barracks. So Antipatris is about 25 miles from Jerusalem. So after they get safely clear of the religious, bloodthirsty mob, they outside of Jerusalem, the soldiers that were on foot turned back, and only the ones on horseback apparently moved on. So, which is 70. And so he's got 70 horsemen, and they continue on to Caesarea. And verse 33, when they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will hear you when your accusers have also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. So this is apparently not a prison here, but it's a detention center. Herod's praetorium, under guard. And apparently this Felix, he hoped that Paul had come from another province that he's not responsible for. But the fact that he was from Cilicia meant that Felix is responsible. He does have jurisdiction. He was hoping to go, oh, out of my jurisdiction, hot potato passed off, because Paul is a hot potato right here. And the commander was happy to be rid of him and sent him off, and he got him out of his assigned area, which is Jerusalem at this time. And now we're going to see here, we see from his letter that there's nothing to charge this man with. There's nothing deserving of death or imprisonment even. And so let's just go on to chapter 24. I had some other stuff there, but I'm going to pass on that. Chapter 24. Now, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. They gave evidence to the governor against Paul. So as Felix had directed, he's not going to hear Paul's case until his accusers are there, and he's going to do it at the same time. And so it took 5 days for these accusers to retain, pay, and prepare a lawyer. And this was a Roman lawyer. You can tell by his Tertullus. And apparently he was a skilled prosecutor. They call him an orator in our text here, but he was a lawyer. and he would be able to speak more fluently Roman law and things like this. But as we're going to see, he doesn't. There's no Roman law he can cite, so he has to just use the hearsay of the Jews. So, and when he was called upon, another thing to notice about verse 1, Ananias, the high priest, comes also. This is really unusual. The high priest comes and he brings the elders with him. In other words, the signal is not just the religious leaders in Jerusalem, but also the tribal leaders, of the different tribe of Judah and this and that. He brings the elders of the people there too, showing that all Israel is against this man, Paul. That's what they're trying to signal here. That's signifying that all of the leadership in Israel is with the prosecution, basically. So verse 2, and when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, seeing that through you we enjoy such great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. We accept your foresight, the fact that you're having us live in such great peace. So this account here that we have from Luke in our text, he's the historian that recorded this. This is a summary of the buttering up that this Tertullus and the flattery that he's slathering on Felix in his opening statement here, and that this works. But the Bible condemns it. I was going to quote a bunch of verses on flattery, yes, and but it's okay. You take my word for it. It's in there. The intent here is again to signify that they're if Felix doesn't rule in their favor, they will complain to Rome, and all the elders in Israel are. So your governor that you've assigned over us is causing problems over here, and that's kind of the underlying threat. You wouldn't want it any other way, right? That we accept it, what you're doing always and in all places with all thankfulness. You wouldn't want it any other way, right, Felix? And then most noble Felix. The Jews that were here, the elders in particular, must have really winced when they heard most noble Felix. But more on that as far as some background on him. But Ananias, he didn't wince at it because he's just as evil. The high priest Ananias is just as evil as Felix is. But I'm sure the elders kind of gagged on that most noble Felix comment. But anyway, this Felix, Antonius Felix, some historical background on him. And I love the fact that you can go to Wikipedia right now and put Felix, proconsul of Judea, in you'll get to read all this history about him. And it's just as our Bible says it is. And it comes from secular history as well as biblical. They're not just taking the Bible's word for it. Wikipedia, you name it. It's all got all this in it. But the only reason Ananias is actually the high priest, again, see, he was the high priest. He was removed because he got accused of something. He got taken to Rome to testify. And while he was over there, another high priest got selected, and his name was Jonathan. Well, Jonathan had also gone to Rome to complain about Felix. And Felix heard about it. He complained about Felix because Felix was he was raiding Jewish homes and killing I'll read some of the quotes from that later, I think. But apparently he got his opposition to Felix was a little too vocal. And when he got back to Jerusalem, Felix hired some Jewish assassins and had Jonathan killed. So they sent Ananias back, and Ananias got basically reappointed or temporarily appointed as the high priest again. So it's interesting, backstory on it, but the popular Jewish position was they opposed Felix. They hated Felix because of his oppression of the Jews, and so they agreed with Jonathan. Well, Jonathan was killed, so the Jews would normally. That's why I say they winced at this most noble Felix thing. Felix had put down several Jewish insurrections with such brutality that the Jews, rather than thanks, they would see him as a horrid, wicked man. He was filled with injustice, according to historians. In particular, he ordered a massacre of thousands of Jews right in Caesarea, right where this I shouldn't say capital, but it's where the governor's seat was, and the seat of military power in Judea for Rome was in this city, Caesarea. And they routinely looted Jewish homes and things like this. He just sent just to get the money for himself. And so he was thoroughly wicked. And there's a lot to be said about Felix, but historically it gets us way off track here. You could read about him yourself. Now they've got their quisling of a priest in there. It's Ananias. And I had mentioned last week that he was well known for his wickedness, greed, and murder and corruption himself. And so he and Felix are very the same. They so they're like two peas in a pod. All right, verse 4. So here's Tertullus he's still giving his case for the prosecution here. He's nevertheless, most noble Felix, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. We'll be brief. We won't waste your time. This matter is quite simple, and it's beneath your magnificence. So either Felix is completely delusional, or he kind of sees this as over the top flattery. So here Luke's going to give us what their case is here. Let's look at verse 5. For we'll be brief, and here it is. For we have found this man a plague. Well, that's kind of nebulous of a charge, isn't it? A creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. That's Paul's influence in his 3 missionary journeys. A creator of dissension among all Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So we have found, I guess that's their evidence. We have found, we've determined that there's your evidence. And so just this void of substance. Notice what Tertullus calls the Christians the sect of the Nazarenes, suggesting that Christians are an offshoot of Judaism. Well, Paul's going to deal with this in his response. A ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Well, as you know, and as we've seen in our study of the book of Acts and our study of the Gospels, true Christianity has one ringleader, and that's Christ Jesus. And Paul gives himself a title, and it's slave and bondservant and servant. Bondservant is a purchased slave, and he has a master, and he is very clear about that, who his master is that he serves, tirelessly serves. Verse 6, he even tried to, so Tertullus, again, going on here, he says, he even tried to profane the temple. And we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. So their point here is we wanted to handle this ourselves. This is an internal Jewish matter, and we didn't need to waste your time with it, most noble Felix. It's a Jewish affair. And as we saw from the commander, what he said, their intent was to kill him right there. And it says here, he even tried to profane the temple. And this was a fabricated charge, as we saw back in Acts 21 in verses 26 through 29. But anyway, so they're this is an internal Jewish affair. We would have handled it, but look at verse 7. We would have handled it, but the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come to you. So commanding us, now we had to travel all the way up here and trouble you. And by examining him yourself, you may ascertain that all these things which we accuse him. In other words, you're going to be able to see that we're correct here after you examine him. And all the Jews assented, maintaining that these things were so. Yep, that's right. So now here they are with zero evidence, just this, a little buttering up flattery, some nebulous charges without evidence. And obviously it's true because we found it to be so. And all the scientists say it's true. So. But they even malign the Roman commander Lysias here. They say with great violence, which is not the case. They're the only ones that were violent there. They were the bloodthirsty mob, and the commander came and stopped the violence while they were beating Paul to death. But they say, examine him for yourself, and you'll see that we're correct. And so they've all made themselves guilty in this falsehood that was in his speech, but they're really not agreeing with any facts. They're agreeing with conclusions, but no facts and no actual testimonies and no witnesses. And verse 10, let's see Paul's response. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, inasmuch as I know that you've been for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. So I was only there 12 days, including my trip here. It was only 12 days, and notice that Paul doesn't no buttering up here. He just says, I know you've been governor here a while, judge of this nation, and not like their flattery was, but they had these slanderous charges against Paul without any evidence. And he says, look, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. He wasn't there to make trouble. And so let's look at verse 12. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, that's about the sixth time we've seen Paul and others refer to Christianity as the way, which they call a sect, so I worship. So he's saying, I do confess to you that I worship according to the way. I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. In other words, the same scripture that they claim to believe in is the same one that testified about Jesus. And again, we only see small parts of the text here from Luke, but we can certainly guess that Paul was making the connection here about the way. And they called the sect of the Nazarenes because they were trying to malign Jesus, because Nazareth, as you recall, was not known for its high morals and high society people, and that's why they always said Jesus of Nazareth. It was like an insult. But Christianity accepted that. Yeah, he did. He was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth. Yeah. And okay, where are we here? Believing all the things written in the law and the prophets. So he says, this is according to that way I worship God. And you know what? This is the last thing that the Romans want to get involved in, is how people worship their God. Remember, in the Roman Empire, they had, I forget how many gods that were approved to be worshipped within the Roman Empire. And if you were teaching another god, it was one of the accusations they had of Paul, that he was teaching about another god because he was preaching the deity of Christ. But Paul says, no, it's not another god. It's in the scriptures that he is God, and God is one. This is God. Jesus is God. The risen Christ is God. Anyway, they tried to pin that on him, and he was able to get out of that. But they were saying he was bringing another God, unapproved God, into the Roman Empire. Well, he's saying, I worship God according to the scriptures and according to the way, what they're calling the sect of the Nazarenes. So his point is, this controversy, the whole thing is a matter of religion. And the Romans have learned that the Jews handle religious controversies with much blood and violence, and they're sick of it. It's caused all kinds of problems throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, we saw back in, I forget what chapter now, when Paul was in Corinth, he met, what are their names? The man and wife. Anyway, he met them there. They had been expelled from Rome because Caesar had expelled all Jews. Didn't matter Christians or not, Christians or Judaism, didn't matter if they were ethnically a Jew, they were expelled from Rome. That's how sick of it the Roman Empire was. They wanted them all out. And because of this right here, religious violence all the time, they'd resort to mob violence because there was a bunch of Christians in Rome. And so the Roman emperor said, I don't care what you are, if you're a Jew, out. And anyway, so they're sensitive to this. And so this resonates with them. Paul saying, this is a matter of religion. And here we go again. The Jews get into blood and violence. And Paul makes it clear in the end of this verse 14 that he believes in all things that are written in the law and the prophets. The same scripture they claim to believe. And Paul's point is, this way is not a sect. It was revealed to them. If they would not ignore it, it was revealed that the coming Messiah would come and do exactly as Jesus did. And so he's not saying this is a new sect. He's saying this is what if their eyes were open, they would be believing the same thing. Verse 15. I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. Now, we saw last week, we talked about this, the Pharisees and Sadducees. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, but the Pharisees did. And probably most of the accusers that had come were among the Pharisee sect of the Sanhedrin. And Paul knows them, and he says, just as they do too. And so we're clear here, there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. Everybody's going to rise again, and there'll be a day of reckoning, a day of judgment. And this includes Felix, who he's talking to here, the just and the unjust. And it's not lost on Felix. He catches that. We're all going to be responsible to God for our behavior, and we're going to be examined before him, just as I am being examined right now before you, Felix. And the truth of the resurrection of every human is in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Not only the soul of the person rises, but the body rises again. And every Christian should be firm on this truth. Romans 14:10 says, "For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ." And if you want to look at an Old Testament verse, here's Proverbs 23:18. "For surely there is a hereafter, and your hope shall not be cut off." There is a hereafter. And people instinctively know that this is true. Humans, all of us, know that this is true. This isn't the end. And he says, your hope shall not be cut off. Great verse from Solomon in Proverbs 23:18. So let's move on. Verse 16, the resurrection. He says, "This being so, the fact that there's going to be a resurrection of the just and the unjust, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men." Well, if you knew for sure that was the case, that you're going to sit before the judgment seat of the Creator, you're going to strive naturally to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Verse 17. "Now, after many years, I came to bring alms." So he was out on his 3 missionary journeys, remember? "And now he comes to bring alms and offerings to my nation." You see that? We've seen this before, where one of Paul's purposes was he had made collections at all the churches that he established. Then he went back and visited them again and again. And he made a collection to bring to the Jews because he knew they were oppressed in that religious hot. He bring it to the Jewish Christians, I should say. The alms were for Jewish Christians, the poor Christians in Jerusalem, and that's what he was bringing. But his heart was back with his nation. You see here, "Bring alms and offerings to my nation, in the midst of which some Jews," while he was in the middle of doing this, he says, "some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult." So I wasn't causing any trouble. And verse 19, he says, "They ought to have been here before you to object, the ones who accused me in the first place, if they had anything against me." And he makes it clear that when he says Jews from Asia, they're not even from your jurisdictions. The one who brought the charges are from Asia. These are outside troublemakers that stirred up trouble in Jerusalem and against one of your citizens, me, Paul, and they're not even here to testify. And so this is a good point on Paul's part. Verse 20, "Or else," so they're not even here. "If they had anything against me," he says in 19, now he says in verse 20, "Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council, unless it is for this one statement which I cried out standing among them concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged to this day." And so Paul's saying, look, the ones that are here, the ones that did bother to show up, speak up now if you got any charges against me. And of course, nobody does. But he says the one statement he made that caused a little uprising was, and it was an uprising not against him or against Rome, it was the Jews against the Jews. It was the the Pharisees against the Sadducees. They couldn't stand the fact that he said that he was being judged by them because he believed in the resurrection of the dead. And so it had nothing to do with any violation of Roman law. It had nothing to do with any violation of Jewish law, because half the Sanhedrin Council believes in the resurrection. Verse 22. "But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate..." Now, am I out of time? Okay. All right, let me just read this. Felix heard, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings and said, "When Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case." We'll deal with verse 22 next. So that's the end of the little trial there, and we'll pick that up in a couple Sundays, I believe. Brother Todd?